Welcome all. My name is Amy Elman, and I'm speaking to you from Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I teach at Kalamazoo College in the Political Science Department. We're really thrilled to have all of you with us today. Welcome to ISGAP's first in a series entitled The Intersectionality of Anti-Semitism. Given the global pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, its online presence and related inroads into the mainstream, there may be no greater challenge for scholars today, scholars of anti-Semitism, than to reconsider our assumptions about who anti-Semites are, where and how they mobilize. And this is part of a 12-part series. We're going to be having 6 talks in the fall and six talks in the spring that interrogate the identities of anti-Semites, those identities that they presumably possess, the ideological positions that they prefer, and the very places that they inhabit. With an eye towards anti-Semitism's ideological fluidity, as well as its contradictions and corresponding convergences, we're interested in original, interesting, and emerging areas of anti-Semitism research. And to this end, one of the things that we did this year is we invited researchers to present work on a range of topics that include, but aren't exclusive to, racism, misogyny, and heterosexism. Additionally, we'll be considering the growing convergence between social movements and/or corporations, including news outlets and social media platforms, whose legitimacy and indeed bottom line are informed by an opposition to or a deep connection with anti-Semitism. And given our interest in the insights that can be gleaned from comparisons across regions, as well as those that can be had from in-depth country-specific and site-specific case studies, we're especially delighted today to have with us Professor Jessica Emami for her first in a series talk entitled The Ayatollah Khomeini's Anti-Semitic Rhetoric, Iran's Revolution, and the Betrayal of Women. Jessica Emami is an Iranian-Italian-American sociologist and oral historian with expertise in gender, Iranian anti-Semitism, and technology. Jessica's current research on anti-Semitism is an in-depth analysis of the speeches and the political activity of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And her research elaborates on the works of such experts as on Islamist anti-Semitism as Matthias Kunzel and David Patterson. She will today elaborate on the ways in which Khomeinism and the entire foundation of the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime is first and foremost based in anti-Semitism. She's the author of a forthcoming book. It's going to be very exciting because it's entitled Cybercrime and Punishment, Lexington Books. It's coming out next year. It's a book that describes how and why consumers use social media to punish, or if you will, quote, cancel others. An alumna of the ISGAP Oxford Summer Institute, Jessica has been active in the field of anti-Semitism since 2018, and she holds a PhD in sociology from George Mason University and is fluent in Farsi and English. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Jess. I turn the video and mic feed over to you right now.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hope I can live up to it with my talk today about the 3 things that we're talking about, which are Iranian women, anti-Semitism, and what happened in the revolution. So the question I asked myself was, why did women support the revolution in great numbers, including secular and educated women? So without further ado, I'll just get into my talk. In 1978, the Ayatollah Khomeini's sermons from Paris railing against the Shah and his puppet masters, the United States and Israel, were heard in the streets of Tehran. In response, middle and upper class Iranian women donned headscarves for the first time in their lives to join their working class compatriots in the street protests. The reasons for this cooperation by secular and educated women are complex. Nevertheless, had women recognized the vehement anti-Semitism in Khomeini's words, they may have reconsidered joining the protests that led to the victory of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 that also eclipsed their hard-won and limited freedoms from Sharia law. A cursory examination of Khomeini's written words would demonstrate that his ideas had much in common with the virulently anti-Semitic Muslim Brotherhood, who also rejected modernity by espousing women's return to Sharia-based domination by men. I think that when totalitarian ideologies such as Nazism, fascism, and Islamism elevate one idea above all others, they also always render women and minorities as their first victims, and mass killings are not far behind. So in this talk, I'll briefly outline the totalitarian vision of Khomeini's Islamic government, describe his demonological anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, explain how his worldview is necessarily paired with patriarchal views of women's roles that go back to the 7th century Sharia law. And then I'll describe the losses the women experienced after the revolution was staged. And finally, I will return to the Pahlavi era to conclude that although Iranian women had more discursive ways to fight for their freedoms under the Pahlavi modernist framework, they were also prevented from having any political input into what modernity might look like for them. They therefore voted with their feet for Khomeini, wishing to forge their own identities as Muslim women. But this front journey to emancipation ended in failure because Khomeini's vision of strict Sharia guardianship conflicts with women's freedoms. And had they recognized the demonization of Jews as a signal of jihadism and Islamism that is not unlike the Muslim Brotherhood, they may have known that their rights were also on the chopping block. The reason is that the Muslim Brotherhood and Khomeinism has 3 pillars that are very important. For them, it's Muslim control of the Middle East, women going back to Sharia law of the 7th century AD, and the eradication of Jews from that area. These are the 3 pillars. Khomeini's Islamist doctrine rejected Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi's efforts at modernization and secularization, an effort he stated was necessary because the United States and Israel are bringing corruption and Western influence into Iran, and they want to destroy Muslims and drain their financial and natural resources. It was a trope and a conspiracy theory. His prescription was a fundamentalist theocratic government for Iran that he hoped for the greater Middle East. He said in speeches that Muslim unity was the only means to rid the Middle East of US and Israeli dominance. He also believed that Shah's efforts to give women a greater public role was a ruse created by Israel and the United States to corrupt Iranian youth and turn Iranian women into prostitutes. He was talking about in the 1940s when he talked about the unveiling mandate by the Shah's father. He stated, the unveiling of women has caused the ruin of female honor, the destruction of family, and untold corruption and prostitution. Using Sharia as a divine justification to return women to their essential nature as men's subordinates, he believed in separating men and women in public spaces, turning the veil in its extreme form into a religious duty, and restoring Sharia guardianship of men over women. His ideas about Israel and the West parallel 2 of his closest friends and associates, the Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani and the cleric Mujtaba Nawab Safavi. Both of these men had cut their political teeth in Iraq between World War I and World War II, and were steep in Arab anti-Zionism. Kashani was a close friend of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, and the Muslim Brotherhood leader, Sayyid Ramadan. Navab Safavi was a friend of Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the co-creator of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Navab Safavi even sent fighters to aid the Palestinians in the anti-Zionist movement of 1948. And when he was back in Iran, he founded an Islamist group that many believe laid the foundation for the Islamic Republic as Khomeini was interacting with Navab Safavi. The group was called Fedayane Islam, and they advocated for Islamic government, the expulsion of Jews from the Middle East, this was before Israel, and a return to fundamentalist Sharia law respecting women. And they supported using armed violence to achieve this goal. Navab Safavi was executed for attempted assassinations of high-level political figures. In March of 1963, during the Kennedy administration, it was a very unstable time for Iran, and the Shah brutally attacked seminarians and worshipers at the Fazia Seminary in Qom because they were giving subversive sermons against him. So 3 months later, in June of 1963, Khomeini gave a vitriolic speech that ended up getting him exiled, not because it was horrifically anti-Semitic, but because it made the Shah see, he framed the Shah as Israel's hypnotized slave, kind of. So he portrayed the Shah as Israel's hypnotized slave, and he also called the forces that raided the seminary, he called them Israel's black agents. And he blamed the Shah seminary attack on Israel. So I'm going to do a quote now of what he said. He said, "Israel doesn't want the Quran in this country. Israel does not want religious schools in this country. Israel doesn't want the rules of Islam in this country. Israel smashed the seminary by its black agents. Israel wants to take over your economy and destroy your agriculture and trade. Israel doesn't want us to have wealth in this country, but wants to seize the wealth with her agents. What is the connection between the Shah and Israel? Is he Israeli? Is the Shah a Jew?" This was one of the parts of this seminal speech in 1963 that got him exiled. Khomeini's references to Israel certainly possessed what historian Norman Cohn termed a quasi-demonological superstition and conviction that Jews form a conspiratorial body set on ruining and dominating the rest of mankind. Norman Cohn believed that when this kind of hatred is present, it leads to genocides such as the Spanish Inquisition and the Holocaust. One can even see evidence of Khomeini's coupled Jew-hating and medieval views about women going back 2 decades before 1963 to a manuscript he wrote pseudonymously under a different name, where he blames Jews of colluding with Christians, imperialists, and atheists to create a Jewish state and destroy Islam. And for women, in that same brief, he advocates flogging for adultery, an end to unveiling, an end to coeducational schools, women working outside the home, and women talking to unrelated men. So by 1963, he was also against the Shah's plan for women's suffrage and against their voluntary service after high school in a literacy corps that is not unlike the Peace Corps. At the prospect of allowing women to vote or run for office and opening the vote to non-Muslim minorities such as the Jews and the Baha'i, he stated that giving women and non-Muslims the vote is weakening the foundation of the nation. The government is allowing women to become judges and giving preferential treatment to Baha'is who are really Israeli agents. So everything that he exclaimed or complained about was related to Israel and the Jews. After the Islamic Revolution, his policies placed women's bodies and reproductive capacity in the service of the revolution. The new constitution for the Islamic Republic declared motherhood the most important calling for women. And he swiftly returned Iranian women to a new old order by mandating veiling, lowering the age of first marriage from 18 to 9, and abolishing the limits instituted by the Shah on temporary marriage, which was a form of legalized prostitution, polygyny, divorce by repudiation on the man's part, and automatic paternal custody after the age of 2. He also instituted for the first time in Iran's history the punishment of stoning for adultery. He restored gender apartheid on buses, beaches, schools, universities, and many other public accommodations. So immediately after the revolution, tens of thousands of women were forced to retire or go into exile or were fired. And women vanished from entertainment, cinema, artistic venues, except for a few approved sort of angelic roles as wives or mothers. And women judges, such as the Nobel Prize winning Shireen Ebadi, she was a judge, was dismissed for being too emotional, which again, they got that out of Sharia and the interpretation of Sharia by Khomeini. The first woman minister of education, Farrokh Parsa, was executed by firing squad just after the revolution for sowing corruption on earth. So during the Iran-Iraq War, which was a terrible war of attrition between 1981 and 1988, Khomeini urged women to produce as many children as possible and offer them up for martyrdom in the war effort. He cautioned women to safeguard their chastity and dignity so their husbands could concentrate on warfare with peace of mind. And he also praised women who were proud of their sons' martyrdom. A scholar named Afshar stated in 1982 that Khomeini's codification of motherhood as women's highest calling is eerily similar to Hitler's campaign for German women. In Mein Kampf, Hitler stated that the German girl belongs to the nation and with her marriage becomes a citizen. And Hitler used to give a special award to women who had 10 or more children. Where Hitler demanded reproduction to serve the Aryan race, Khomeini demanded the same for reproducing Muslim warriors to fight and expel the infidels, which included Israel and Jews. With so many warning signs about the prospect of losing their rights after the revolution, I ask, why did Iranian women from a large cross-section of society support Khomeini? And I think the answer lies in 3 significant factors, only the third of which I'll have time to explore. First, I think the state under the Pahlavi monarchs only partially eliminated Sharia-based restrictions on women. So it created a contradictory structural condition that kept women in a legally ambiguous or insecure position. So it wasn't all the way, so they weren't sure what their rights were going to look like. Second, despite the swift modernization under Mohammad Reza Shah, the emerging urban economy was not providing high enough wages to most women workers, many of whom were still illiterate. So the utopian promise of protection by male guardianship looked good to a lot of women. And third and most powerful was, which is the one I'll talk about, is the repressive way that the state and royal family chose to address Iranians' growing political discontent. And that was by suffocating political expression by all Iranians, except for the Shah, and I think by permission, the Empress. This suffocation was enforced through the Shah's secret police, Savak, the internal police that boasted 60,000 members by the time the regime of the Shah ended. So there was a lot of mistrust of one another. I do want to counter, though, that the Shah recognized the importance of sexual politics and the need for modern women's roles to be more active and more public than what had been allowed before in Iran. They were reformers. His father, Reza Shah, instituted secular public or private education for women in the 1920s, the first opportunity for women to be educated at all in Iran. He also instituted forced unveiling without addressing Sharia. But over time, many young women came to enjoy remaining unveiled And I think the secularization of Iranian society indelibly empowered all Iranians, including Iranian women. Now, the Shah also had a semi-governmental top-down organization of women scholars called the Women's Organization of Iran that was run by highly competent women reformers who worked within the Shah's permitted framework to pry away Sharia restrictions in marriage, travel, employment, and child custody, and transferring authority from clerical courts to civil law courts. So by the last days of the Pahlavi regime, Iranian women were in government with 2 cabinet members, 2 senators, 19 members of parliament, and several judges. Women were 20% of the workforce. However, despite all of these limited reforms, Khomeini, along with many Marxist and many religious women, dismissed the WOI, this organization, and their reforms as foreign agents trying to imitate the West. So one set of women were anti-capitalist and didn't like any kind of anything going on in the system, and the others were aghast at the swift changes that the global economy industrialization was bringing into Iran. So on that front, a vastly unequal distribution of wealth was particularly visible and caused quick urban decay and poverty of the working class, and anomie by the migrants who would come from rural places looking for jobs and just seeing like, this city is crazy. It's not anything that I recognize. The infiltration of wealth and Western music and dress and sexual norms into the Iranian urban cultural milieu exacerbated the religious secular divide and created cultural dissonance. We have the simultaneous presence of old, new, Eastern, Western, traditional, and modern, and Iranians remained very unsettled. I'd like to show you a photo of these dissonances, what they look like. So I'm going to share my screen here. For example, here is a Vogue cover from 1963. It's a woman in a very, to a religious Muslim, this woman is nude. She isn't like partially clothed, she's nude. Now, this is at a Persepolis, which is an ancient city.
Jessica, we don't see your PowerPoint, we see your image folder.
I see. Oh, it's not a PowerPoint, it's just the image.
But we don't see the image, we see the whole folder.
Sorry, I shared the wrong thing. Okay, so I'm gonna fix that again. 1 second. I see. Okay, so share again. These are technical things that occur.
It's the Zoom era.
I think I picked the wrong thing. There we go. There we go. Okay, can you see that?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so this was a cover of Vogue. So it's a Western model who's been transported to Tehran in 1963 at the Achaemenid Empire seat that was in Persepolis and was burned down by Alexander the Great. So okay, so, and yet she's nude in Iranian eyes. This might be somebody in a mosque, and that's pretty sacrilegious. So to traditional people, again, it's the 60s. And I will show you some juxtapositions of modern and new. This was very common, like in my alley, I would look out the window and see caravans of sheep and camels and horses going through, and there's a car back there. These were hostesses for Iran Air that I can guarantee you people would say, you know, their skirts are too short, but that was the Western fashion at the time. This is my friend Jacqueline Lavie-Saper, who wrote a book whose title just got you in your face about that era, from miniskirt to hijab. You could almost say it should have been from hijab to miniskirt to hijab if a woman could live that long. But her life turned around because of these juxtapositions. These were people on the beach, like high schoolers on the beach in the 60s. Juxtaposed with people who, you know, wouldn't know what to do if they saw that. So, and where's my Elizabeth Taylor? Okay, I don't have Elizabeth Taylor. But another story I had was that in 1976, Elizabeth Taylor visited Iran with photographer Firuz Zahedi. He was the brother of this very bon vivant ambassador that we had, who was known in Washington, D.C. in the late 70s to just flash cash and give parties. Firuz, his brother, photographed the alluring Taylor wearing colorful Iranian traditional costumes in various rural and urban settings, tea houses with villagers looking on. She went to Persepolis, the seat of the first monarch of the Persian Empire. And just these incongruous images that he did were iconic and pointed to a stunning dissonance between ancient and modern, and portrayed, I think, a traumatic rupture of the traditional Iranian ways. So while wealthy Iranians kept the intrusive eyes, ears, and arms of Savak by channeling by channeling their energies into benign or sometimes subversive versions of art, music, culture, and sex, hundreds of thousands of religious and anti-capitalist women were not aligned with the WOI or Shah's reformers and didn't view any benefits from what was going on in the Shah's government. Many of them felt partially they could agree with Khomeini's Paris missives when he came out on a cassette tape and said, "The Shah's civilization spread corruption and immorality. Cinemas are places for filth. He expanded houses of ill repute. We oppose expansion of this type of immorality, but we're not against civilization." So these incongruities were precisely the ones that Khomeini seized upon to capture and articulate the sentiments of most Iranian men and women. He said, "The type of freedoms we have here is a destructive freedom. Men and women are free to fall upon one another at the beach, and they're free to go to centers of debauchery. But who isn't free? Those who cannot pen one word about improving the country, those who cannot utter one word about him," meaning the Shah. The type of freedoms he allows are colonialist freedom, imported freedom. Just, I think, as the Shah himself spent his last days in this liminal space between his crumbling dictatorship and his possible demise, I think the women of Iran spent their days and the months before the revolution in this liminal space, rejecting a set of imperfect rights and freedoms for what might be offered by an extremist cleric who had already written so much about what he thought about the rights of women, which were awful. Had they read, they actually organized in 1979 in March, after a lot of these rollbacks on their rights happened very swiftly, they organized and demonstrated within weeks, which was unheard of. And tens of thousands of women came to the street at that time to demand a reversal of the reversals, to no avail. They were told by the Comité, which was the gun-toting youth for Khomeini, who later became the IRGC, "Veil yourselves or be beaten." So, but I feel that had they read the tea leaves of Khomeini's work that were steeped in medieval values regarding women and steeped in hateful anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism, and made the connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, they may have been more cautious in assisting the men to bring this man to power. So now I think about all these events and I think, well, how is this relevant to our life today? And I find some relevance. I find that this anti-Semitism has gone global. Particularly in the form of the BDS movement. I see it, for example, when Rashida Tlaib gave a speech to the Democratic Socialists of America. They've adopted the BDS position that Israel is a colonial power. It's a settler colonialist power. I see it in the Women's March, particularly since we're talking about women. It's very relevant. And Dr. Elman has talked about this before. There were women who wanted to march with a rainbow flag that had a Star of David on it and were thrown out of the march because they were Zionists. And for me, that also translates to because they were Jewish. So these things, and also one of the people, Tamika Mallory, who organized the march, is a huge fan of Louis Farrakhan, who was an awful anti-Semite. So these things are now, should be a cautionary tale for us. If you're hearing these kinds of demonization of Israel, beware, it's gonna turn on you. That is my cautionary message to everybody about where this stuff is going. It hasn't gone away. And I think, in fact, the next parts of my research are to justify that the entire regime, the entire thought framework of that kind of Islamism is based on genocidal hatred of Jews and anti-Zionism. So with that, I'm going to close and I'm going to take some questions.
Great, Jess. Thank you so much for a very interesting and provocative talk. So we're opening it up now to questions and comments.
Am I supposed to look at the chat? Yes.
I'll do that for you.
Oh, okay, great.
Do that for you.
I can't walk and chew gum at the same time.
I have a
You're
feeling.
welcome. I'm sorry. You're also welcome to raise your virtual hand if you like and address the question directly. There we go.
Thank you. Bram, why don't you go? I see you up first and then Corinne
Okay.
After.
First of all, I thank you very much for the presentation. Very, very interesting. And I feel a great deal of connection with seeing those pictures. I remember, I don't know if you remember, Expo 67 here in Montreal. And I remember going to the Iranian pavilion, as we called them, and seeing all those presentations, and in the nearby areas, very, very different images of other countries from the Middle East. And from to me, a lot, just as a feedback and a quick comment, I think the pendulum swinging towards modernity, as you put it, met a brick wall. And I think the idea of what Khomeini did and was able to rally was to say there were problems going on in Iran, and the biggest one being the absence of freedom for so many people, that it was enough to organize, help organize this kind of resistance. And I think, like a lot of other politics, they, as we see with the Democratic Party in the US, they just look for support wherever it'll come. And if you happen to be anti-Black or anti-Jewish or anti-Israel or something else along the ways, welcome to the club, because we need soldiers. We need boots on the ground to go against this main directive. And I think that if you look back at, if we look back at the general trends, there's always been this challenge between the Middle East countries, Iran as an example, and Europe and the Western modern direction that we're pulling everybody in. And I think it's very common. We see it with China now. We see it with so many other countries. And I like the perspective that you've presented for that reason, because it's not just recent, it's not just Khomeini, it's a general movement, and you are either on board with this general movement forward, or you're in a segment that wants to go a different direction. And I think it's a natural tendency to want to reject everything, throw everything out, and start, with a blank screen and redo it. And I think that's where these organizations come from. So I'd like to hear your comment back on that.
Yeah, I'm glad you also connected it to present day politics, which, I hadn't really thought about that connection, except in the context of very specific settings, like I said, the Women's March. But I like how you say they just need boots on the ground. you know, but it's important to know what we're fighting for, because it can turn on us. And also, is it really based on, what is it based on? And what I'm seeing it's based on is anti-Israel, anti-Semitism. That's the thing that just hits me between the eyes of all of these movements. Like, take that away. If that wasn't there, what could we talk about? You know, and there's not much there.
Thank you. And now, Corinne, and we also have some folks in the chat. So Corinne Blackmer.
Jessica, thank you so much for your awesome presentation. I really enjoyed. Question, I have both a comment and a question. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Ken.
My comment is that I am fascinated, speaking about the relationship between the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and today, is the ready way in which women will abandon their own interests. And this can be said as well for LGBTQ people. Abandon their own interests to follow some other ideology, which is not simply another ideology, but one that's designed to destroy them or to demean them drastically. And so that's something that we saw in the Iranian Revolution. I see it today. I went to the Women's Studies program the other day in my university, and I said, what are we doing about the issue of gender apartheid? And I was literally told that this was problematic because it intersected, that word was used, with Islamophobia, and that we could not be Islamophobic.
I see.
I hope everyone's connecting those dots, because you could not, you cannot, you should not critique an Islamic regime, because that would be Islamophobic. Now, Jasper Puar is to some extent responsible, she and her minions, for this sort of rhetoric. But I see it again and again and again in different times and places. The Women's March, for example, and other instances that you mentioned, this perpetual dynamic of women abandoning their own interests or to follow some other ideology, so I have to assume that anti-Western ideology is an extremely compelling construct, that anti-Semitism is an extremely compelling construct that overrides anyone's rational interest in their own liberation, freedom, expression, so that gender apartheid, that women will come to accept gender apartheid in the interest of being anti-Semitic and anti-Western. I was wondering if you could comment on that observation.
Yeah, it's incredible. When the first thing you said, Corinne, also reminds me of something you're going to talk about, which is LGBTQ people who are espousing ideologies in places that are very homophobic, and, you know, they kill people. And Khomeini's Iran is one of them. So I really find that very interesting. I think the way to tackle these things is scholarship. For example, when you talk about gender apartheid, it's very interesting that veiling is not actually an Islamic, you know, a scholar could come and tell you veiling is not Islamic. The women in Islam were not veiled until they reached Eastern Asia and saw veiling that was happening in other religions for different reasons. So I think all of these practices need to be teased out in a scholarly way and written about. And then once that is out, talked about, you know, we're not Islamophobic, we are for legal equality between men and women. Now, and there are also things that are codified in Sharia, in the Quran itself, that you really can't fight against. But to those, I say, you know, there's stuff in the Torah that's pretty misogynist, and we want out, we want reform. Therefore, we need to talk about these things. And I think it's incumbent, one thing in my talk is there's a very vibrant movement among Muslim women, especially in the West, who are challenging these their own religion. And it's important to find out who they are, and start, dialogues with them, and just get the scholarship going.
Jess, is there anyone to that end that you would suggest those of us who are tuned in now could read or listen to? Do you have suggestions?
Well, for example, on the Iranian front, I have two books. One person is Dr. Janet Afari. She has written a lot about Iran and Iranian politics, but she's aware of the Islamic rules and Islamic laws. And there's an older book, and the reason I say older book is because right after the revolution, a lot of women were so aghast that there was this like flash of scholarship that was anti-Khomeini, and then it stopped. And then everyone got gagged. And the only things that were coming out were like very sort of soft touch, coddling, those kinds of Islamist values. But there is a book called In the Shadow of Islam. And I will send out the name of that, but it's called In the Shadow of Islam. And it's about Muslim women dealing with their own fate after the revolution.
Well, thankfully, we've got Daphne, for those of you who are interested, putting into our chat some sites that you've mentioned, so you don't need to worry about that. We've got several more folks on the line, and before I go to either Habital or Benjamin, we've got a chat from Joseph who asks, why weren't Iranian Jews all killed after the revolution? And another chat, just before we go back to some folks on screen, was how to begin to deal with this for young adults. So those two chat comments for you, or questions.
Okay, so I'll tackle the first one first. Why weren't Jews all killed? So there is a tradition of Jews living as subordinates without any ambitions of political rights. They had one representative in parliament that was the token. And so that's called Zimmi status, which is people of the book, the people of Abrahamic religions. And to some degree, they have to follow that. And the incentive is, and I've seen this in Khomeini's writings, is they get a lot of poll taxes from infidel poll taxes, jizya from people who are not Muslim. And he wrote in some of his writings on the Islamic government, he wrote, it's a very good way to get money to help our community buy jizya. So I think that's one incentive why he didn't like kill everybody, but he did do something that was a shot across the bow to all Iranian Jews who were at that time about 125, 150,000 people, which was the largest Jewish community in the Middle East. He took one of their leaders, who was a very philanthropic man who had created tens of thousands of jobs in industries for Iranians. He was very wealthy. He had a very good relationship with Israel, had land there, owned buildings, did commerce, brought products in, took products out. So Khomeini came in and arrested him, and everyone's like, what do they want with Haj Habib? They call him Haj because it's an honorific. His name was Habib el-Ghanayan. And he executed him for being a Zionist spy. So once that happened, the Jews there was a mass exodus. And what he said to the remaining Jews were, Zionists aren't even Jews. So that's the way he cut the mustard, by claiming that Zionists are not Jews. Now we've seen this where, they say, oh, the Ashkenazim are from the Khazars and blah, blah, all these lies. But that was a way for him to return Iranian Jews to Zimmi status. In other words, don't you dare have any ambitions towards Israel and Zionism, but you can live here like you were living before, in your own communities, doing your worship under our protection, paying your jizya, that's your status. And actually on some Jewish buildings, I have heard that they write on it, Zionism, something like Zionism and Israel is entirely separate from our community, from the Iranian Jewish community. It's on every building. So that was the conditions under which they were permitted to live and live to this day. The community's grown somewhat, but it's very sort of quiet and ghettoized now. And they're not very wealthy people.
Thanks, Jess. And the question from the chat concerning how best to deal with this for young adults.
Well, I'm not sure what is meant by this.
In other words, your presentation, how do we communicate to younger folks what's at stake and some of the main points you're making? That's what I'm presuming.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's important when you hear something like, you know, Israel is a apartheid state or doesn't have a right to exist, or really it's not even a real state or shouldn't have been there, and things that are so delegitimizing, that should be a red flag for everybody. The depth of that statement, I don't think is meaningful enough for most people, especially young people.
And here, before I go over to Havital, I would give, I would strongly endorse Naya Lecht, who will be talking about pedagogy in our series. So that's Naya Lecht. So be on the lookout for that, because that's her specialty, is reaching out to younger folks. Havital, you're on the line and wanting to ask Jess a question. You're next.
Yes, I actually want to make a couple comments. First of all, I completely agree with Corinne, and that was going to be my first comment. And I want to add to that, it's not only the women and the LGBTQ. We also have Jewish senators in, and I guess congressmen or women, that when Ilhan Omar said that the Jews had hypnotized the world, so now I know where she took that from.
Yes.
They basically did nothing about that. And Senator Blumenthal from my state used to be what I call a very warm Jew. I saw him at a few pro-Israel events at the Jewish Community Center here. All his 4 children volunteered in Israel, and he didn't do anything about that. Neither did Schumer, neither did Schiff, neither did basically all the Democratic members of Congress. Not one of them stood up and said, this is unacceptable. And when they did finally do some kind of anti-hate, it wasn't against anti-Semitism. They really, really watered it down. As far as the Women's March, there was also Linda Sarsour. We really cannot forget her. And there is another Somali woman that is the exact opposite of Ilhan Omar, and she has a foundation. It's called AHA. She is very against circumcision of women, I forget, female genital mutilation, and various other things. Her name is, and I'm happy to write it in the chat, is Ayan Hirshi Ali, and I am on her mailing list. And since we brought up Islamic women that are against the oppression, I felt that I would like to add her. So I don't have a question, just a few comments.
Well, thank you so much for your contribution, and hopefully we can get some of the sites up. Jess?
So Havital, I want to say something about being hypnotized. I sort of took what Ilhan Omar said, and the first thing that flashed in my mind was the way Khomeini claimed that Israel was influencing the Shah. He didn't use the word hypnotized, but it was the same thing where you're just like their automaton, you know, and they have so much influence on you. So in that sense, that is where that came from, you see.
Thanks.
But he didn't use the word hypnotize. He used the word like under the influence, being controlled by, da-da-da.
Thanks for the
being a
clarification.
slave.
So now we've got about 8 minutes left. There's Ben, and then a question after Ben. I'll wait until Ben goes on.
So thank you, one thank you as well for this very illuminating lecture. But I'd like to ask you, when you address the question of why Iranian women supported the revolution, in spite of all the ominous signs that it's going to go against them, actually what you suggested is that they were identified with the economic demands of the masses and the solution that the revolutions offered them. Now, if we take that to a more generalized level, what you actually suggest is that their economic solidarity was much stronger than their gender solidarity, which is quite striking. I mean, in theoretical terms, how do you explain that? And how would you explain also the fact that even today, there's a huge amount of women who still keep supporting the revolution, even though they know, and I guess someone could tell them that it actually changed their condition to the bad, to the worse. So how would you cope with an argument that actually Iranian women, and I come from a different discipline, I study Orthodox Judaism. Here as well, you can find quite a lot of women who actually say modernity doesn't only help us, but modernity truly, us as women, threatens us and impair our femininity, impair our family values, impair other things. So we are part of the defensive against modernity, and it's not just a matter of feeling that economic solidarity is stronger than gender solidarity, but from their perspective of gender solidarity, they see the traditional values as defending them and working for them, not against them. How would you cope with such a suggestion?
Well, I think many of those people, let's go to, there were two groups. One were the religious Iranians who are very similar to the Orthodox phenomena you just described. And for them, the sort of chimera is they're trying to stop the runaway train of modernity by embracing being protected by patriarchy. So it's a protection system. You give up a lot, but then you have, your husband's supposed to pay for you, your every need and things like that. But there was something written about that called Right-Wing Women that Amy was telling me about. Could you tell me a little bit about that, Amy, about the religious women?
Sure. So there's a fantastic book that came out, probably in the 1980s by Andrea Dworkin, and it was called Right-Wing Women. And she was trying to understand why so many women went with conservatives who had really no interest in their rights. And she talked about the ways in which they perceived the left as being more amenable to their sexual exploitation, right? So this comes through modernization. That they would rather be captive in a traditional marriage in which only one man has sexual access to them than many. And there are lots of insights in that, in a special chapter devoted to anti-Semitism. So I'd strongly suggest that folks look at Right-Wing Women. But I'd like to move us along because we've got two more questions. One from Charlie, who asks, Jess, can you speak about the Iranian interest in nuclear weapons? And then after you're done with that, we'll close with Bram, who's got one additional question for you, and then we'll be concluding.
Yeah, so nuclear weapons is really not my area, but I do have ideas about it and thoughts about it and feelings about it. And my feeling is that Iran is now, in the same way as, let's say, the Taliban is trying to do dominance in Afghanistan, and it's trying to become like Pakistan in the sense that it is untouchable. Their system will become untouchable once they achieve that nuclear weapon capability. And we see that this is a problem because the reason the Taliban are back is because they were backed by Pakistan. And Iran wants to have the same type of situation. And I think to people who say, well, whatever, you know, Israel has a nuclear weapon, the states have a nuclear weapon. Well, all of these Islamist governments are becoming stronger. They're now talking to each other. They're holding down civil society groups, punishing dissidents, and becoming sort of this patchwork of dictators. So becoming permanent is what they're after. And the nuclear weapon is their path to that. And they must be stopped, I think.